I'm Andrew from Safety Pilot, and today we're talking about drones. I want to talk about the increasing number of drone pilots, and specifically pilots' relation to those drone pilots. And I'm using pilots here, referring to anybody who's flying but not flying drones. There are a lot of different types of pilots. I'm not going to break them down. There are pilots, there are remote pilots. I'm calling them drone pilots here. So those are two categories here. And I've gotten increasingly, as both a drone pilot and an airplane pilot, I've gotten a number of comments that I've heard towards drone pilots just not really being happy about them. So that's one thing I'm going to address. Pilots who have something to say against drone pilots and some of their complaints. And then secondly, for the bigger category, I think there are a lot of pilots who really don't understand how drones operate. If they've not flown them themselves, they don't know what their limitations are. And I think that's also a problem. I think if you're flying, you should understand who else is flying to ensure safety and to know how they're operating and how you can operate in a way that doesn't hinder them and vice versa. The first thing I want to point out here is there are a lot more drone pilots today than there were yesterday or the day before. It's changing that fast. I went to PCI exams recently, and for those who don't know, this is an FAA designated site that does all the testing for the FAA for if you want to get your maintenance certification, if you want to get a pilot certification, if you want to be an instructor, you got to go to PSI exam station and take a test. I asked the proctors what is the test that they give more than any other test. And take into account here that they don't just do aviation tests. They do construction, they do medical licensing, they do insurance and real estate licensing. They do a lot of different testing. The two proctors there said that the most common test that they give is the Part 107 drone pilot test, which is huge. It's saying it is a big paradigm shift in aviation. Drones are taken to the sky like never before, and we need to be ready for that. We need to be aware of how they're operating, where they're operating, and fly safely with them together. So again, let's start breaking down drones. I'm going to talk about three things first that I've heard pilots complain about, which I think really arise from misconception. There is some truth in their complaints that I'll also talk about. And then fourth, I'm going to break down a typical flight from a drone pilot. As a drone pilot, I'm going to walk you through my pre-flight all the way to my post-flight debrief, show you what I'm looking at, what tools I use, what apps, and what a typical flight might be like, and how that relates to pilots. I think it's important both for drone pilots to understand we're not the only ones flying, and pilots. There are drones, and they're going to be more and more, and you can't ignore it. So let's look at what pilots don't like about drone pilots. Number one, they're stealing our airspace. What a horrible thing to say. There are a growing number of near misses and even collisions with drones from all different types of aircraft, airplanes, gliders, and helicopters. Drones are being hit, or drones are hitting aircraft, however you want to say it. And there is, a seeming infringement. So I understand where the sentiment comes from. But I want to address this by saying that innovations in new technology in aviations are generally not a bad thing. Usually they lead to a better future, more safety, and more readily available aviation to everybody. We need to understand that aviation is still rapidly growing in the history of humankind. I think we're still in the very early steps of aviation and of flight, and stepping on the neck of the new innovation. I do think drones are a new innovation and a future. Stepping on the neck and saying, they're a sickness that's killing us, I think that's very arrogant. We also need to understand that aviation is multifaceted. There are a dozen different types of aircraft flying. There are lots of different personnel flying, and we're all sharing space together. Second thing to calm down the pilots is drones fly very low. The typical max flight is 400 AGL, and without a permit or an exception, drones will not be flying higher than that, whether commercial or recreation. They're low flyers. For most aircraft pilots, that does not constitute a huge problem, as aircraft typically are only that low on landing or takeoff. Exceptions to this are things like ultralights or experimentals that just like to fly low patterns, you know who you are, or bush pilots. Let's talk about the second complaint I've heard, which is drones don't have ADS-B. As far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, drones are not allowed to have ADS-B equipped on them. A lot of pilots don't like this. How can I see a drone? And a lot of these drones are small. You're not going to see it until you've hit it. You might not even notice that you hit it. Depending on what you fly, you might think it was a bird. You might have thought it was turbulence. It's a reality. A lot of these drones are small. You're not going to be able to see them even when they're really, really close. So what are you able to do without ADS-B? Well, the FAA is not blind to this, and they're putting out something called remote ID, which works very similar to a transponder. It's going to output information such as altitude, speed, identity of the drone, where it's flying from, where it's flying to, and this information will be available to the agencies that need it. But I think the second facet here is even more important. All drone pilots are required to keep their drone in sight during flight, with very minor exceptions for this. You need to see your drone. And this allows a drone pilot who's doing their job to be able to see and avoid other aircraft. When you look at the hierarchy of aircraft, drones fall very near, if not at the very bottom. It is a drone pilot's responsibility to remove their drone from the area when they see or hear an airplane or other aircraft. Third complaint I've heard, drone pilots are amateurs. They have less testing requirements, easier to get a drone license, and most drone pilots have very little experience flying. Let's break this down. So historically, drones have mostly been operated by the military because drone technology has been expensive and just not as available for the average consumer. That is definitely not the case anymore. It's very easy to buy a drone, take it out of the box, and have it up in the air within a couple of days or even hours. So that is something that needs to be addressed, and the FAA is definitely addressing it. Part 107 has come out, which is similar to Part 61. It talks about all the rules drone pilots need to follow. And most drone pilots will need to go through Part 107 training. This will bring them through things like airspace, weather, pre-flight inspections, limitations, emergency procedures, aeronautical decision-making, risk management. So a drone pilot who's doing their job well has gone through that and is keeping that in mind on every flight they do. They're not just taking off into airspace not knowing what the heck they're doing. There is a cutout from Part 107 that allows for recreational flying, which many pilots do still fall into. It gives size requirements for the drone, so not size, but weight requirements for the drone, as well as it still gives operating limitations for drones. So you can't just take a drone out of a box that you just bought and take it up into the air and just say I'm flying it recreational. You still need to be following community-based guidelines. You need to be following your trust training. There's a certain type of training you have to go through, and you need to be carrying those documents on you at all times. So a drone pilot is a trained pilot. Now I will sympathize with pilots who have complained about this, saying that it is definitely much easier to get a drone license, either whether it's Part 107 or recreational. Yes, the FAA is focusing on training. I think there still is a ways to go, and definitely take into account too that if somebody's flying a drone commercially or for a government agency, they have likely gone through a lot more training than just the average 107 pilot. So lastly, for all you people who really don't know a lot about drones or just interested in what it's like to fly a drone, I want to take you through a flight. So we're going to jump into that, and I think this is good for drone pilots too. I'm going to talk about what they should understand about aircraft pilots, other aircraft pilots, and then pilots, what you should understand about how drones are flying, what they're thinking about. So let's jump into it. Let's fly.